Hello and welcome to my channel. I'm Dr. Carmen McGuinness, and this segment this evening is a follow-on to an earlier segment on narcissists and the type of individual who's attracted to them. In that segment, I addressed the detached avoidant personality type and how he's created during infancy and early childhood, how he comes to be the way he is through his attachment with his primary caregiver. And I addressed the anxious personality type who tends to be the type who's attracted to him and how her childhood forms her. In the current segment, I'll address how the latter, the anxious personality type who's drawn to the narcissist, can heal. I recommend that you view the first segment before this one if possible. You can click the link above to do that. So today I'm going to focus on one way in which the anxious personality type can begin to heal. Though there are other approaches, creating a cohesive personal narrative has been found to be very helpful. As explained in the first segment, the anxious personality type has told herself a story. She's imagined or fantasized that she had an idealistic childhood. You recall I referred to this as the fantasy bond, which was an idea developed by Dr. Robert Firestone. And in adulthood, she recreates the fantasy with the men she comes to love. Having done this since childhood, she's become quite adept at believing and living in her fantasy. Rewriting her narrative makes it more cohesive and less of a fantasy. Making it more cohesive and less of a fantasy is one way to improve her quality of life, relationships, and overall happiness. The narrative is the story of her life. It's the story of her relationship with her parents or other caregivers. It might extend to include her relationship with siblings and friends, her adjustment at school. Her existing narrative might depict loving, attentive parents, perhaps with a few acceptable foibles, but it's perhaps more sugar-coated than her true life story. Our narrative, it should be explained, of our childhood is a lens through which we see the world. And the problems with having a false narrative are as obvious as the problems associated with having the wrong lens. When we have an idealized story coding a less than perfect reality, we unintentionally support the imperfect past by pairing it with the perfect fantasy. This is a basic principle of behavioral science. Pairing the negative with the positive makes the negative more tolerable. Now, I'm not talking here of reasons, but of mistruths. For instance, if your mother was emotionally unavailable much of the time when you were a child, because she was, say, a single mother working 2 jobs, yes, that's a reason. And that reason definitely does belong in your personal narrative. It doesn't excuse her emotional absence, but it does explain it. However, if she was emotionally unavailable because she was an alcoholic or a drug addict working 2 jobs, this reason also belongs in your narrative. Not some more acceptable, sugar-coated version, not a mistruth. You see, it's the mistruth that ends up supporting a negative self-image, and here's how. Let's say your narrative is, Mom did the best she could working 2 jobs, when in reality, she rarely gave you the time of day and was a pretty lousy mother, often leaving you to cook and care for yourself in other ways. By leaving out the important details, you're left with, I mustn't have been worthy of Mom's time or energy. And this translates today as an adult into, I'm not worthy of anyone's time or energy. So we see how this can be a problem. This negative self-talk might might not even be conscious to have the impact that it has on your relationships. And sometimes it's bringing it to consciousness that is what needs to happen. Whereas the truth, Mom was an alcoholic who didn't give me much of her time and energy, precludes I wasn't worthy of Mom's time or energy. It's the truth that needs to be told in your narrative. Here's another example. We'll go into this one in more depth. This is an actual client who, for the purposes of this video and protecting her identity, we'll call Emily. When Emily first came to me, she described her parents much like this. Dad was amazing. He took me on cool outings and always had time for me. We talked about everything from politics to pop music. My mom wasn't much of a people person. She didn't really need other people, but she was a good mom. In adulthood, Emily had been married twice and had had an affair with a married man after each marriage. 2 different married men, 9 years apart. Emily's first husband had cheated on her with multiple women, and her second husband had been aloof, emotionally unavailable. Emily described him in the same way she depicted her mother. He was very independent and didn't need other people much. Although she came to see me regarding relationship difficulties, Emily described herself as confident and picky about romantic partners. During sessions, she frequently said she was no longer interested in a traditional relationship. After 6 months of hard work challenging Emily's self-image and questioning her narrative, she had a very different story to tell. Today, Emily's new narrative is, Dad cheated on Mom throughout my childhood. Mom was distracted by Dad's cheating and was emotionally absent through much of my childhood. And about herself, Emily says, I was a shy kid, clinging to my mother much of the time. I guess I learned early that if I stayed very close to her, she'd give me attention. And sadly, I got the idea that the other woman is the one who gets Dad's attention. Very different story, but one that is authentic. Indeed, Emily's first husband had done much to reinforce her theory, cheating on her with at least 3 women during their 2-year marriage. She'd married a man just like Dad. And so, after that marriage ended, she went and got herself a married man of her own, one that would pay attention to her. And of course, as you can well imagine, this was deeply unfulfilling, so she married again, eventually, about a year later. And because it was emotionally unavailable people that Emily had learned to manage during her childhood, she married another one. Although Emily's second husband didn't cheat, that we know of, he was, like her mother, distant and emotionally unavailable. After 8 years, the second marriage ended, and Emily again found herself with a married man, a different one than the first time. Still craving that attention and affection that she'd learned only comes to the other woman. It wasn't until seeking the help of a therapist that Emily began to heal from the deep wounds she'd received during her childhood. Another problem with a false narrative is that it requires constant repetition. Think about it. The story is just there. The truth is. The true story is just there. It's the truth. It's out there. We needn't retell it over and over again. But the fantasy requires just that, retelling. It requires that we tell ourselves the story, the fantasy, to make it real and to remember it. Another obvious problem with the fantasy narrative is that it actually gets in the way of the real fairy tale, true love. It's not likely you'll find the right person for you when you're not presenting the real you to the world. In the case of Emily, it was only after she did the difficult work of rewriting her personal narrative, a more accurate and authentic version of her childhood, that she was able to form appropriate and authentic relationships. Emily's ending is a happy one, but it took many years. I hope this has been informative and helpful for you. If so, please give me a like and do subscribe. As always, if you wish to talk, please click the About tab for information on how to book a session. And if you viewed this before viewing the other one, please go back now and view that as well. Thank you for stopping by.